All right, welcome to another edition of the SpectrumCast. And this one happens to be the Data Resilience SpectrumCast with health checks. And as always, I'm joined by our illustrious crew. We have Jason Basler, Jim Smith from development. How you guys doing today?
Good, Steve.
Good, thanks.
Great. And Todd Ozorzak. Todd from support. How you doing today?
Very well, Steve. Thanks.
Great. Good to have you all here today. So in this particular episode, we want to talk about SLAs, SLOs, and basically data recovery. So why don't we just jump right in? Jim, why don't you start and give us a little bit of an overview of SLA, SLO, recoveries? What are we really trying to get at here?
So I think by definition, service level agreement objectives, it gets around a predefined set of measurements that you contractually are going to meet. So when we think of, I've got a database, a SQL database that I need back in 2 hours in case of a disaster or the user actually dumps it, then that by definition is a service level objective. That's something you kind of measure against. And then the service level agreement tends to be, okay, what are the penalties or the financial ramifications if you don't meet that specific or a set of the objectives during recovery? So in a broad sense, it's really, the concept around you have a set of measurable objectives that you can prove, that you can meet, and then you have a contract around that.
So the SLAs are more like the business agreement. What are we going to try to hit, right? And at the end of the day, in Spectrum Protect Plus, we talk about setting SLAs, very much the equivalent in that particular case as to what we do in Spectrum Protect around just basically setting up the policies, right, Jim?
Yeah, and the difference, though, I think a lot of times we tend to focus on the backup products with the backup policies. And what you're trying to do really is figure out how to engineer around steady state, what's happening to the system every night so that you can ingest the proper amount of data to have the recovery points. Unfortunately, a lot of times customers don't really think about their service level objectives or agreements, or they're hard pressed to even quote them.
True, because a lot of times IT isn't talking to the business. The business has certain agreements that they need to be able to maintain to stay in business, while IT is very, very busy at putting things together to make sure that they can just follow some basic objectives, 24 hours to recover data, make sure I can do it within that window. Then I know what to tell the boss when he comes in and asks me, hey, how long is this going to take, right? Hey, Jason, just out of curiosity, I mean, all of these things have to do with basically just recovery, right? I mean, ultimately, Todd, you brought this up beforehand. I mean, it's pretty interesting. What do we sell? Do we sell backup or do we sell recovery? We sell backup, but ultimately the clients want recovery. So, Jason, as the recovery applies to our blueprints, and I know you and Jim spend a lot of time in our blueprints, how do kind of these, whether it be SLAs, SLOs, or policies, kind of relate to the blueprints? Do the blueprints help clients architect for recovery, or is it just to say, hey, if I have an environment that's this big, you need this kind of horsepower? Just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think we could dig quite a bit into that. I would say one trap you can fall into is being hyper-focused on the backup portion of your sizing. And certainly the blueprints do have quite a bit in that. As Jim mentioned, steady state is sort of a focus. Can we get through these daily backups over and over again? And one thing we have to realize is a lot of optimizations in our products are tailored to making that backup as efficient as possible. So technologies like incremental forever, where when you're in that steady state, you're just sending up the changes. You can process, thousands of systems in a backup window because you're just doing the changes. But if you flip that around and say, well, what would the recovery look like? You don't get the advantage of only recovering a portion of the data. You've got to bring it all back. So all those optimizations around backup can get you in a bit of trouble if you don't think through the recovery part of it. And so, one aspect of that would be, can I isolate things together based on the kind of criticality that they have with respect to a recovery? So one way to accomplish that might be grouping things together. So you might have one of your SLAs just managing a subset of your data that's of the utmost importance, and that can give you a number of valuable points of flexibility. One is for meeting your recovery point objectives. That critical subset of systems could be set to do more frequent backups, right? They might be able to manage backups more frequently than once per day. Or certainly if you have applications such as databases, you could set up things like transaction log backups that would give you really fine-grained recoveries. Much finer grained recovery point objectives could be met. But also the placement of your backups, right? You could dedicate a storage repository on higher performing storage, let's say an all-flash data protection repository, for example, just for those critical components. So the SLAs give you the flexibility of placement, in addition to more obvious things like how long are you going to retain the recovery points for. So you could use those placement rules to keep that critical subset on higher performing storage to make it so that the recoveries run faster. Back to your point, the blueprints obviously reference some tested and well-defined hardware configurations that we give as reference architectures. And we do publish the restore throughputs for those systems. But, kind of the nice thing as a software-defined product, you can use those references and build some, even higher performing variations on them to cover your critical subsets of data.
That's good to know, because I think a lot of times we talk about blueprints, and if you think about blueprints for like building a house, okay, your house is built, but at the end of the day, you've architected your backup solution, but do you really talk about kind of the throughput for recovery standpoint? And I think over time, and a big part of the reason why we're having these conversations with this particular team is that, as we said in the first episode, you implement your backup environment, and even though you do it maybe even according to the blueprints, over time things change, right? I mean, the most important thing that we know is that just data continues to grow, and much like your iPhone stays slow when you get the iPhone 7 versus the iPhone 13 or whatever they're up to today, right? Some things just don't always keep pace, and you find yourself challenged with being able to make sure that you can kind of meet your objectives. And Jason, you started to tie the RTOs and the SLOs or the SLAs together, and ultimately it's about the recovery time and getting the business back up and running. Todd, I'm wondering, from your perspective when dealing with support and dealing with customers, what are some best practices that you have either probably given to customers to maybe help them achieve their recovery objectives, or that they have kind of mentioned, hey, I do this and it's really helpful. It helps me meet my recovery times?
Well, I think it begins kind of with the beginning, and something Jim alluded to a little bit here is actually understanding what your objectives or service level agreements are, so that you can then ensure that you've architected correctly, you've used the blueprints appropriately for whatever your requirements are. And then it kind of comes back to something we've talked about in a variety of our prior podcasts, and that's just testing that, right? Test it. Are you actually able to achieve your objectives? And those, I think, come in a variety of different forms, right? You might have a single file restore objective. You might have an entire, a larger database for an application, and what are your objectives there? Or a data center objective, right? Which then includes restoring Spectrum Protect as a whole first before you can even begin recovering the machines in your data center. So I think it's understanding, do you have a single objective? Do you have multiple objectives? Do you have different types of objectives for different data? And then it comes down to some of the things that Jason was referring to, is then where have you, where is that data sitting? A single file that was backed up yesterday, you can probably get back fairly quickly. If you need to restore an entire system that you've been backing up over the course of the last several years, that data could be out in a variety of storage pool, depending upon the structure of your hierarchy. And there may be some things that take some time, obviously tape location or co-location, as we've talked about before. And so it's just really ensuring that you understand exactly what your objectives are, the different nature that those could come in, and testing those to ensure that the data is not just where it is from a perspective of how long it may take to get back, but also, do you have it as far back as you need it? Have you retained enough? If you should, if you have some objectives that require you to have data going back several years, more so than just bringing a machine or a system current, are you able to get back something where you have legal requirements or objectives to hold things for, quite a few years, or in some cases even forever? Are you managing that correctly, and are you using the right features and functions, within Spectrum Protect to ensure that you're making your best use of that? Retention sets are a new feature that we've added that allow you to deal with some of those requirements or objectives from a retention perspective that are different from before. Whether you're looking at your archives or your backups, and again, retention sets can come into play there as well. So again, it's really understanding the needs of your business at the different levels that those might exist. And then, once you've configured it from a backup perspective, have you confirmed that, your ability to restore meets those objectives upon return as well?
I think you probably hit one of the most important things that we talk about in this podcast and health checks, as well as the data resilience podcast, is the testing aspect, right? Test, because you can't confidently answer a question from anyone coming down, especially from upper management, saying, can you recover X in X amount of time, if you haven't tested it and you just don't, and you haven't done it and you don't know, right? And when you don't have that answer, and especially when any event happens these days, time is of the essence, and it's critical to better understand what's going on. And if you can't give a good answer, I mean, even if you can do it in the time it takes to kind of meet your objectives, I could almost think of that as a career limiting, not knowing, right, being career limiting, even though you might be able to do it. You got to really test, and you got to practice, and you got to understand. So thanks for that. Another question that kind of comes to mind is, and Jason, I know you say we do publish the throughput for the recovery performance for our environments. And maybe just as collectively together here, we talk about, I can easily imagine that a lot of clients, as they're building out their infrastructure, right, might be somewhat hamstrung by some of the technologies in place. Maybe the company hasn't brought up their network architecture enough to kind of meet some of the recovery objectives that they want to hit. Maybe they aren't able to hit some of the performance capabilities of some servers for throughput sets of capabilities. Meaning, I guess what I'm getting to is maybe the blueprint gets me 90% of the way there, but maybe I can't get the final blueprint to what I want to be able to do, which then would then say, how can I do these recoveries as close as I can to still meet some of my business objectives? And I guess my question is, are there some rules of thumb about maybe looking at your data sets, architecting smaller data sets to be able to do recoveries to make sure you can fit inside of a window? Or are there other tips and tricks we might be able to recommend in that case?
Yeah, I would say certainly that, that's a great point. You could have the fastest backup repository on the planet, but if the disk systems where your production environment is running on are going to be targeted during those recoveries, if those are going to get pushed to their limits, you can only recover so fast, or it may be the network, as you mentioned. So I think, there's a number of potential strategies here. You mentioned kind of keeping smaller data protection, let's call them pods, and, by keeping, well, maybe let's back up. The trend has been to scale these backup repositories up as large as possible. That's great as far as keeping kind of the manageability costs low. You don't have as many servers to keep track of, but you're also putting everything in that one system. And if you need to do a mass recovery, that could become the bottleneck. So there is some value to say, well, let's keep those repositories sized at a smaller level so we end up with more of them. That way, if a mass recovery happens, we're distributing that load out across more systems. So I think that is definitely at the time you're doing a sizing, it's something that's within your control to keep from placing too much in one repository. I think there's also some flexibility at recovery time. You could say, well, we have our primary copy, we have the replicated copy. You could do recoveries from both locations, assuming they're both still intact. kind of, spread the workload out across. You could say, well, I'm not going to only target my primary infrastructure, but I might leverage something like a cloud location to do some recoveries. And so I may replicate into a cloud environment. So should I need to do a recovery, I can spin up systems in the cloud and have, virtually unlimited network bandwidth and storage capacity to make that recovery run faster than I might be able to do in my own production environment. So I think there's a lot of modern tools that are now available that weren't there before, that can be considered as you're planning out your solution with a recovery focus.
Those are some good tips. Jim, any additional thoughts about some maybe tips and tricks that you've heard of or used in the past that you could recommend?
So I think back to maybe what Todd was saying about practicing and tie that in with what Jason was saying about understanding where your bottlenecks are. Because I think one of the things that it's interesting, as we were talking, I was thinking about this, Steve. One of the primary goals of the blueprint for backup is probably cost, right? You want to keep down, the boss is probably saying, what's the cheapest we can get by to do what we need, right? And I think when you're in recovery mode, all of a sudden it's going to be flipped to, what if I gave you a bunch of bandwidth? Can you do it faster, right? What if I gave you a bunch of disk or a bunch of compute? Can this go faster? And that really gets into what Jason was saying with really understanding those what ifs and where your bottlenecks are. And if you could potentially do something, if you all of a sudden your network was not the problem, is that going to help you? Because you got back to the design, the career limiting decisions, but that's where you're going to need to be thinking kind of sorry to use a word outside the box, but that you're going to get all sorts of unwelcome help at disaster time and into these what if situations. And the best you can do is just be prepared by understanding your system, understanding, like Jason said, where are the bottlenecks? And if someone says, I got a bunch of disks to throw at you, understanding how to answer that, right? That's not going to help, or because that's not our issue right now.
Jim, I think you brought up something that we don't often talk about on this podcast, but I think you hit the nail on the head, right? A lot of times, especially backup, because it's considered your insurance policy, you want the cheapest things. You brought up cost, right? How can I architect this and get away with what I'm thinking about at the lowest possible cost? And Todd, I think right at the onset, when we were talking in the beginning, right? Are you in the backup business? Or are you in the recovery business? Well, day to day, like when you're driving your car, you don't really need your insurance. And if it's a nice sunny day and the roads are dry and clear, everything's fine. You don't really think too much about it. But when it's snowing and it's slippery out and there's a bunch of people on the road and they're all trying to get home from work, you're hoping to God you've got a good insurance policy, because if something happens, you want to make sure you can get back on the road with your car as soon as possible, as soon as you can. So I think that's a good piece of advice to think about when you're thinking about your backup environment. Of course, you want to design it and architect it so it's robust and it can stand up, but recovery performance has got to be like the number one thing, because if it's true, data is the most important asset in your business and you need it to keep going, you're going to want to make sure that you've got it when you need it. And that when you need it can be anytime anything happens. And that could be, who knows, right? I mean, anything can happen. Todd, any other words of wisdom you want to share?
I think one of the things that we alluded to a little bit is understanding what maybe prep work you need to do before a recovery, or a recovery of the actual data through Spectrum Protect, or maybe your post-processing after it actually comes back, and make sure that gets included and understood in any objectives that you have, right? You may need to actually rebuild a client machine before you can actually begin the restore. And so what does that actually mean that you need to do ahead of time? What amount of time does that take? On the opposite end, you might restore a critical production database, but then that particular application has to do some post-processing before you're actually able to run live again. So I think sometimes customers don't recognize and build that into their objectives. Yes, you can actually restore from Spectrum Protect the data you need in the time frame you have, but can you do that pre or post-processing, and still meet your full objective? I think one of the other things that we see customers often do is they'll playbook these types of things, and they'll do it early on in their design or right after their initial deployment, and either due to their growth or maybe some changes in their environment, they don't go back and revisit those playbooks from a perspective of do they still apply in their current environment. And that just gets kind of back to the test, and not just test initially and okay, it did it, but now, a year down the road, your environment's changed a little bit, there's been some growth. Does that test that you did a year ago still stand today, or do you need to make modifications? Find out where those bottlenecks today may be that have been discussed, and work through those to ensure that what you tested a year ago still applies today in your current environment.
Yeah, Todd, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, we've talked about it in every podcast, but I think it's no more important than it is here, is to say, if you test your environment, and to your point, do it quarterly, not just every 6 months or once a year, but do it, every 6-8 weeks, whatever you can do. And especially with some of these newer technologies, take Spectrum Protect Plus, you get two kind of capabilities. One, you get the instant recovery because of the way it stores the data and how it stores the data and how it does the recovery. But you also get a little bit of automation, right? Where you can say, hey, on Friday morning when I come into the office, I want this particular database brought up so that I can come in and test and make sure that it's active. And then if everything comes up great, just tear it down. And then that way you don't have to do your entire infrastructure. Of course, you want to do that every once in a while to make sure that when the X hits the fan, right, you can do all that. But ultimately, like you want to be able to make sure you can do it for departments or divisions or particular groups or that sort of thing. So all excellent advice. So again, guys, I thank you all very, very much. I appreciate the time and you guys lending some really good information to our users of our technologies, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.